Hello, my name is Yana Auskin. I am a junior at La Cueva High School, and my topic is exploring simple spatial models of river floods. Can destroy farm fields and prevent crops from growing. My goal was to develop a fast and effective model to predict flooding. Many detailed models already exist, but those tend to require a lot of setup and are difficult to learn how to use. So it would be useful for farmers and city planners, for example, to have a simple model that can run fast and is easy to use. So throughout the year, I worked on two approaches. First, I used a surface chemical reaction network, CRN, simulator with synthetic chemical reactions to represent water flow. For the second approach, I modified the simulator to perform numerical calculations on the water levels based on the neighboring cell states. And then I compared the results of the two approaches to determine the more accurate model. So in this presentation, I will first go over the two approaches that I worked on, and then the results of comparing them. I will also talk about how I used FEMA flood maps to validate the results of the more accurate second approach, the synchronous cellular automata model. Okay. So to begin, I used a surface chemical reaction network simulator because I was already familiar with how the simulator worked. So it simulates chemical reactions on a surface, and the simulator consists of three parts: the initial reactants on either a rectangular or hexagonal grid, a list of chemical reactions governing how the chemical species on the grid react with the neighboring cells, and also a color map that assigns a color to a specific chemical species for visualization. So it's easy to see the progression of the chemical reaction with the use of a color map. When I was beginning, I found that the simulator had many interesting uses. For example, modeling forest fires. So with the chemical species, for example, being burned areas of forest, healthy areas, and currently burning areas. And I was interested to see whether I could apply this framework to model flooding. So I used synthetic chemical equations to represent the transfer of 1 unit of water between two cells. So these chemical reactions just represent changes in the cell state, so just the changes like in the water level. So there are no actual chemical reactions, for example, happening in the water. So it's all synthetic. So for the initial state, I used a hexagonal grid. So that the center of each cell would be equidistant from its neighbors. And on the initial grid, the chemical species were the combination of the water level and elevations for a specific region. And then I used a color map to visualize the changing water levels as the chemical reactions progressed. Okay. So here's an example of a color map with 4 values, 0, 1, 2, and 3 inches of water. So a color is assigned to a specific water level for visualization. And here's an example of an initial state. So the first number is the scaled elevation value in feet, and the second number is the water level in inches. So the states of the cells on the hexagonal grid is the combination of the height and water levels, and not 2 separate grids, because the simulator can only read in one grid. So I was not able to separate the two because that's just part of the simulator. And in this case, the initial rainfall is 3 inches, like the second number across the region. So synthetic chemical reactions represent the transfer of 1 unit of water. And here's an example of one such chemical reaction. So the 2 neighboring cells are 9H2 and 8H7. And for this example, the scaled elevation is 1 foot. So 9H2 is a cell with a height of 9 feet and water level of 2 inches, 8H7 a height of 8 feet and 7 inches. So 1 unit of water is transferred, as seen over here in this bar graph, from like a higher elevation, 9H2, to a lower elevation, 8H7, resulting in 9H1 and 8H8. Yeah, so the blue on the bar graph is water level, and the orange is the height. So the elevation values for all cells remain the same throughout the synthetic chemical reaction, and are just used in calculating to what cell water is transferred to. And there are thousands of these chemical equations, like over here, due to all the possible combinations of two cells with specific elevation and water levels. Okay, so the chemical equations must account for all the possibilities of the combination of two neighboring cells. And to limit the amount of equations, I place the elevation and water levels on a scale of 10. So with 10 elevation values scaled and 10 water levels, there are a total of 100 different possibilities for each cell, and a total of 10,000 combinations for two cells. So 10,000 total chemical equations. So a greater range of height values would result in a more precise simulation, but it would take longer time to run, as a greater range of height values increases the number of chemical equations quadratically, and it won't be able to run in decent time. So there is a compromise between the speed and accuracy of a simulation. So like a larger region has a greater range of elevation values, like a greater difference between the minimum and maximum elevation. And as a result, each of the 10 scaled heights would have to account for a greater height difference, making the simulation less precise. So I used Mathematica to generate the elevation values for a region using the inbuilt geoelevation function. And then I created a corresponding array with the initial water levels. And for this approach, I set the rainfall across the region to be 3 inches, simulating really heavy rainfall. Okay. And then I exported these initial, So after I got the initial grid for the elevation and water levels, I used those to generate the synthetic chemical equations. So for that, I first generated all the possible combinations of two cells combining, and then the two neighboring cells were evaluated to produce the products where 1 unit of water was transferred. So the chemical equations looked really similar to this. Yep. Okay. And then I exported the chemical equations and the initial grid to be used in the simulator. I tested this model on a floodplain in Hidalgo County, through which the Rio Grande flows through, and it flooded in 2010. The image on the left shows the 3D elevation plot of the region, and the results of the simulation are on the right. So the surface CRN approach accurately predicts that a lot of the water will flow into the river, and then the rest will spread out across the floodplain to the right. So the main limitation of the surface CRN model is the scaled heights. So for a larger region, the total elevation difference will most likely be greater, and then each of the scaled height would have to account for a greater elevation range, and as a result, water would be more equally spread out across the region, even though it should accumulate in more specific places. Okay, so to account for more factors, such as, and this model over here, it also doesn't account for soil absorption because that's difficult to incorporate in the CRN framework. And okay. So to account for factors such as soil absorption and the velocity of the water, I decided to modify the simulator to create a custom model for water flow. So numerical calculations would be performed on the water level of each cell based on all the neighboring cell states. So this approach would be also more precise, as the heights would no longer need to be scaled. Okay, so when I was modifying the simulator, I first read in two separate grids, one for the elevation values and one for the water levels. And then I created one synchronous update rule rather than having thousands of chemical equations. So the update rule performs numerical calculations on the water level of each cell given the 6 neighbors' heights and water levels. I used a hexagonal grid, again so that the center of each cell is equidistant to all of its neighbors. And the update rule also makes it easier to account for more factors, such as soil absorption and the velocity of the water being transferred, because that can be directly incorporated into the update rule. Okay. So each cell's water level is numerically evaluated based on its 6 neighbors' heights and water levels. And to create a more continuous water flow across the region, I only transferred only a small percentage of water is transferred, of the possible water is transferred after each iteration, so that it spreads out more evenly across the region. And for example, it's like 1% of the possible water. So I used this equation to calculate velocity. It's directly dependent on the depth of the water and the slope between two cells. I didn't find data for the soil coefficient n. I found data for the total depth of the soil in some regions, but not the specific soil properties. And as a result, I set the coefficient to 1 for this approach. So I created some simple surfaces to test the update rule of the modified simulator. And darker blues represent more water. And so first, I created a sloped surface with a lower elevation towards the top of the grid in this case. And so, as expected, water flowed towards the bottom of the grid and accumulated in the top here. So another simple surface had equal initial elevation values, and a sloped initial water level. And as expected, after some time, the water level evened out. Okay, so then I tested my update rule on a larger region. This area is the intersection of the Rio Grande, flowing from north to south, and the Rio Pueblo de Taos River that merges from the northeast. And initially, the rainfall was set to 1 inch across the region. So on the left is the Google Maps image of the area, and on the right is the result of the simulation without the impact of soil absorption. So in the update rule, the soil absorption can be set to on or off. So this is without soil absorption. And here's the results of the simulation with soil absorption. So most of the water accumulates in the Rio Pueblo de Taos River and also in the middle of the Rio Grande. So based on these results, this region would not flood with 1 inch of rainfall, as a lot of the water would first of all accumulate in the rivers, and then the rest would be absorbed by the soil. So I compared the results of the two approaches I worked on to determine which one runs faster and has more accurate results. Okay. So here's the result of the previous approach, the surface Sierran model, on the same region with the intersection of the Rio Grande and the Rio Pueblo de Taos River. And so here's a side-by-side comparison. On the left is the surface Sierran model, and on the right is the synchronous cellular automata model. So there are similarities based on where water accumulates in the rivers. However, due to the scaled heights of the surface CRN approach, water is more equally spread out across the river and also the land next to the river, in comparison to the synchronous cellular automata model, where water accumulates in specific places. The second approach, the synchronous cellular automata model, is more accurate and faster at predicting the specific places where water will accumulate at, and this model is also able to account for soil absorption. The surface CRN model is less precise just due to its scaled heights. Okay, so validating results. To validate the results of the more accurate second approach, I compared the results of the simulation to available FEMA flood maps. So I didn't find FEMA flood maps for New Mexico, so I used the flood maps available for Florida. Florida has many rivers, and the properties along the rivers have high chance of becoming flooded. So on the left is the flood map for Indian County, where the deeper purple has a higher chance of becoming flooded in comparison to like the orange or white. And on the right is the Google Maps image for the same area. So here's the result of the synchronous cellular automata model on this region in Indian County. And the Indian River flows through here. So here's kind of the Indian River and the area along the Indian River in purple, most of it. Okay. So the similarities between the results of the simulation and the FEMA flood map are circled in corresponding colors. So these regions have a lower chance of becoming flooded, possibly because they have greater elevations, so water flows instead into the river and the area around the river. Okay. So the conclusions. The synchronous cellular automata model resulting from modifying the simulator is more effective than the surface CRN model at predicting flooding regions. It's interesting that this simple model, accounting mainly for the velocity of the water, the slope between two cells, and the impact of soil absorption, is consistent with FEMA flood maps. Okay. And the surface CRN approach is precise to a limit for smaller regions, but for larger areas where water is more equally spread out, for water regions, water is more equally spread out, even though it should be accumulating in more specific places. So future work includes comparing the results of the synchronous cellular automata model to high-grade water modeling software, such as the surface water modeling system created by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's very precise, but it's also difficult to learn how to use properly. Future work also includes accounting for major roads and highways, as water is more likely to flow faster over paved surfaces, and it's important to predict which roads are in danger of flooding. I'd like to thank my mentor, Darko Stefanovic, and my teacher, Mrs. Lozano, for their help and encouragement. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Yana. Judges, questions?
You modeled rain falling from above. Did you model water coming in from upstream and going out, going out downstream? And if not, would it have made a difference?
I accounted for just rainfall, like 1 inch or 3 inches. And I'm actually thinking whether it would have made some difference if I accounted for water flowing upstream and downstream. I think the main goal for this was to like highlight the places where water would accumulate. So I think accounting for, well, some of the water flowing downstream would have produced similar results as there would have still been water in the river. So water would have flown into the river from the rainfall, and also because it was in the river there. So I think it would have made definitely some difference. But for the main region showing where water accumulates at, the the image would have been pretty similar.
Jana, where did you get the idea of applying a chemical reaction network to this? It's very creative, first of all. How did that, just tell me that background or where that came from.
Oh, yeah. So, well, I was just playing around with it and it looked interesting because it was it was simple to use. Like there were just 3 main parts. And then I realized that the main model is kind of like an asynchronous cellular automata, so not a synchronous one where the middle cell is compared to all of its neighbors, but rather just to one neighbor. And then I started looking at like asynchronous cellular projects that could be modeled using asynchronous cellular automata. And so I was just looking through that. And also for the simulator, they had an example with the forest fires, just with 3 cells, like the healthy areas, burning areas, and burned areas. And so that would result like the chemical reactions. And it was really interesting how there are only 3 types of cells. And yeah, then I was just
I'm sorry, the 3 types of cells are in the water case or in the forest fire case?
In the forest fire.
Okay, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I was just looking, I searched up like asynchronous cellular automata, and one of the results was flooding. And I thought that was really interesting. So I thought about how I could use the simulator to model flooding. And originally I started off with a really simple model just to like check if it worked. So the elevation values were, I think I created like a pond in the middle with like a flat bottom and then really high cliffs surrounding it. And then I placed some water on the cliffs and then in the water. And I did this all by hand. So there were a few chemical reactions, maybe like 20. And it seemed to work. Like the water flowed into the pond. And also one time I started off with water just in the pond, with half of the pond having water and the rest of the pond having no water. And it evened out. So I thought this is really interesting, but I would need to use also something else. Like I can't do everything by hand because there would be too many chemical equations. And yeah.
Okay. And just one follow-up question. Your elevation data often comes in a regular grid versus a hexagonal grid. Could you see adapting? How would you adapt either one of your models to a regular grid? Like squares versus the hexagons.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't really have to do a lot to adapt like the height grid. The height grid is already like in a rectangular grid, so I wouldn't have to adapt that. Like for when I was modifying the simulator, one of the inbuilt, like I could select whether I wanted the initial state, like the water levels. They already had for one grid everything built in. I had to build something else for the height grid. So I could select whether I wanted that as a hexagonal or rectangular grid. And for the height grid, so I wouldn't have to adapt for the water level either. I could just select, I would like a rectangular grid. But for the height grid, I had to add another reader because the simulator only originally can read in one grid. So for the height grid, I added in another reader, And to modify it for a hexagonal grid, I looked at how the simulator already modified the water level grid. So they shifted like every even row one onto the left. So for the height grid, I did that as well. And for the neighbors, depending on whether the row was even or odd, I discarded 2 of the diagonal neighbors, like the corner neighbors, so that it would have 6 neighbors. So I wouldn't really have to modify a lot to get a rectangular grid, but for a hexagonal grid, I had to like shift everything, like every odd one or even one. Yeah.
Thanks, Shannon. Awesome.
Were you familiar with the CRN models before you came into this project?
A bit, yeah. I was working with it over the summer, and yeah.
So this is Dave Gamke.
Yeah, I was a bit familiar, so yeah.
So very nice work and development. You know, it strikes me that, you know, one of the things we describe in New Mexico, that if you don't like the weather, you should drive 5 miles or wait 5 minutes. And so an interesting aspect that I think you should think about is sort of non-even rainfall. You know, where, you know, and of course, one of the big worries with flash flooding on rivers in New Mexico is that it may rain someplace well away from you that you can't see. And so you have to worry about that in the rivers. So, you know, thinking about how to extend it, you've also got a great opportunity in terms of mobility of sediments to add to your chemical model, right? And so have you thought about any of those aspects and where you'd go from there, and where, you know, where people have already worked on some of those issues?
Well, the rainfall, like the sky rainfall, seems really interesting. Yeah, I've thought about, so in my model, I just placed like 1 inch of water or 3 inches of water. So I've thought about doing like a continuous rainfall where water is added to the grid like at a constant rate with like small amounts. So after each iteration, the water would first flow somewhere, then to be absorbed by the soil. But then with the continuous rainfall, water would also be added to the system. So I thought about that. And
okay.
Yeah, for the papers, like I've read a paper and they did a study with continuous rainfall, but I didn't really look too closely at that.
Okay. Yeah, a recommendation for you is to look at the water modeling for the upper Mississippi. So particularly sort of Minnesota and those sorts of areas. There's been a lot of work in the last few years because rainstorms are coming through in different ways than they have traditionally in terms of timing during season and in terms of how those fronts flow across the system. And so, you know, you've got a good beginning to then look at those sorts of complexities. It's actually more complex than the Florida system. Florida was a real good one to start with, but looking at some of the water flow and flood maps for the upper Mississippi would be a great next step. So nice work. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll take a look at that.
I was wondering, in your testing of your model with slopes and things like that, what you said is your boundary condition and what behavior you observed for the water as it flowed downhill. Were you able to watch it in any way? Or
yeah.
See the end result?
Yeah, the simulation, it produces a video, and then I just took the final results and put it in the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so did it flow smoothly or did it slosh or anything?
Oh yeah, it flowed pretty smoothly. Yeah, like I could kind of got gradually like more blue towards the bottom. So Like you could see, like from the top, it got more turquoise and turquoise, and then bluer and bluer, and it was very gradual.
Okay, thank you.
Or, yeah.
Thanks.
Just to follow up on that, what would it take to make it slosh? If you look at your equation, you're doing velocity, but to make it.
Yeah, I think, so I'm transferring only a really small, like, percentage of water. So it doesn't really like go too high, like when water is transferred. So I'm thinking if I transferred a greater percent, then that would cause water.
Or maybe
like,
too, if you
slosh,
had
yeah.
like mass and momentum, right? Perhaps.
Yes. Like
If
maybe
there's like
greater
a momentum,
velocity.
or
Yeah.
with a mass term.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
Cool. Yep. Yeah, you're getting into fluid dynamics.
All right, judges, we're out of time. Yana, thank you very much. Great job.
Very cool.
Thank you.